Hello, my name is Alexi Nix, and I am going to be presenting preservation metadata, implementation strategies, more commonly known as PREMIS. Some history about PREMIS. In the early 2000s, there was some discussion surrounding the necessity of preservation metadata. This discussion was primarily targeted around the cultural heritage community and the practical experiences when using metadata. They wanted to build on the Open Archival Information System, and in 2003, OCLC and RLG started the Preservation Metadata Implementation Strategies Working Group. They worked internationally on the problem and concluded in 2005 with a report called PREMIS Data Dictionary for Preservation Metadata. After the report, the project was then picked up by the Library of Congress and is currently maintained through the PREMIS Editorial Committee. When it was created, the original working group received 2 awards: the Digital Preservation Award from the Digital Preservation Coalition in the UK in 2005, and a year later, they were given the Preservation Publication Award by the Society of American Archivists. The work was described as intellectually sophisticated, groundbreaking, truly collaborative, international in scope, and is of great significance to the archival preservation community. Largely today, PREMIS is considered the standard for defining preservation metadata. Not only is it a highly coordinated application, it is also considered the most comprehensive, detailed treatment of preservation metadata to date. So why preserve metadata? Broadly, to ensure long-term accessibility and provenance. Specifically, it is argued that a resource must be stored securely so that nobody can modify it. Files must be stored on media that can be read by current computers. Preservation managers must employ preservation strategies to ensure the resources remain usable, including migrating old formats to newer equivalents, or emulating old rendering environment on newer hardware and software. These strategies require metadata about the original file formats and the hardware and software environment supporting them, and since migration or emulation can put authenticity of the resource in doubt, creating metadata can help support authenticity by documenting the digital provenance of the resource. In this way, PREMIS considers objects as immutable. If an action is taken on an object that changes it, the result is a new but related object, allowing for museums, archives, and libraries to keep record of provenance for the intellectual entity. At this point, I feel going in further into the why relates less to PREMIS and more to the larger preservation discussion. If you're interested in that topic, like I was, I've included a few resources in my linked resource page. Instead of elements, PREMIS uses an equivalent they call semantic units. If you've already watched Professor Pomeratz's lecture on PREMIS, you may note that I have only included 4 of the semantic units. Excluding intellectual entities, in the new version of PREMIS, version 3, established in 2015, the PREMIS data model was revised to make intellectual entity another category of object. In the same revision, environment was also added as it relates to maintaining an object usability, such as metadata pertaining to hardware and software needed to use digital objects. Currently, PREMIS version 3 has the semantic units, objects, events, agents, and rights. Objects are made up of either bit streams, files, representations, or intellectual entities. A good way to think about each of these objects is that bit streams are the data within a file. The files are a collection of bytes that are known to an operating system, creating objects such as images, documents, or HTML files. Representations are collections of these files that can then be put together to make a larger object, such as a web page, collecting files such as HTML files, audiovisual files, and possibly any style sheets to accurately represent the completed web page would make such a representation. And finally, the intellectual entity is an object that takes a bunch of different representations that were utilized to create the whole unit, such as like a book or a database or other system. Events are any action taken on an object. They record any changes that have been taken, especially when it relates to migration or emulation. Keeping this record is key in maintaining a digital provenance for an object and demonstrating the object's authenticity. Rights metadata help repositories know what you can do with an object, which is very important to the preservation process. Some rights to record that are encouraged are copyright status, license terms, and special permissions. The agent refers to the people that had any role in dealing with the objects, including the events done on the object, the rights that pertain to the object, and they can relate to peoples, organizations, softwares, applications, or hardwares, depending on the objects or the events taken. PREMIS is targeted as a guideline for what information should be obtained and recorded by the repository management system. And the overall goal is that by implementing PREMIS in the metadata of the object, repositories are better able to preserve information resources in the long term. Due to this nature of implementing PREMIS, there are a few aspects that make the metadata significantly different from others. Possibly one of the most jarring is that PREMIS is intended to be used alongside other metadata schemas, such as the Library of Congress's other metadata schema, METS, or Metadata Encoding and Transmission Standard, which was created with two different metadata sections for explicit use alongside PREMIS. On this slide, you will notice the two metadata sections, the DMD SEC and the AMD SEC. In this particular use case, the DMD SEC is being used to describe the actual object, which is a portrait of Louis Armstrong, while the AMD SEC is PREMIS, being used to describe some of the object information, but primarily the metadata that pertains to the preservation of the object. Another aspect of PREMIS is that it is implementation neutral. Or in other words, it doesn't have requirements on the recording of information as long as it is known or recoverable. This came about as a result of the metadata being intended to be used with other schemas. So to allow usability to be translatable between other metadata schemas, it doesn't have specific requirements on recording information, assuming you will already be using specific requirements that you will then translate into the PREMIS metadata. PREMIS metadata is familiar in that it is hierarchical, but also has some semantic units that are mandatory, and not every unit is repeatable like other metadata schemas. Which is to say, it's not repeatable in the sense that you cannot repeat a unit in a specific container, and if you do want to repeat a unit, you will have to repeat the whole container. To the left, you can see one of these containers. The semantic unit being shown is the event identifier, which has the component's type and value. The container then goes into the definition and rationale of the unit, and then points out that this is a container unit, it is not repeatable, and it is mandatory. After we create one of these the event identifiers, we would then need to create a whole new event to use it again. This makes inherent sense as the event identifier is specific to one type of event, and to use it multiple times would not make sense unless you were engaged in doing multiple events on an object, which would also make new objects each time. To the right, you can see how this unit is translated into XML, which is the expected format but is not necessary for use. When using PREMIS, there are a few points of conflict which can be seen through the use of the semantic units. Like I already pointed out, PREMIS is intended to be used with other metadata schemas, so it can cause conflict when determining what semantic units to use and which to include. In the new 3.0 version of PREMIS, some objects description metadata was added, which wasn't present in previous versions. When using PREMIS, the repository needs to determine if they want to use the semantic units present in PREMIS, or if they should use the elements that are inherent in the other schemas that they are using on top of PREMIS. Understanding the limits and usability of PREMIS is up to the institution to standardize. The same can be related to other units as well, such as rights, although regarding to rights, it is argued that only preservation-relevant rights should be included with the PREMIS metadata. Overall, there seems to be continued discussion surrounding object units. It seems that on one hand, it is determined that the object needs to be represented within the schema, but it is inherently hard to determine how much of the description of an object is in its environment should be covered in PREMIS, and how much it should rely on other different schemas. Finally, discussion surrounding the standardization of preservation level is also something that seems to be prevalent, as this is also institutional based and it's hard to give a clear direction on what level of preservation is needed and how to record the policies and roles needed for each level of preservation. That brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you for joining me on this exploration into PREMIS, and I hope you will take a look at my annotated bibliography. I've included some resources about PREMIS and the larger discussion on digital preservation, which I hope you'll enjoy. Thanks.